people are talking about climate catastrophe, and it's inconceivable to me that there are still people today out there who say that climate change isn't real. Can they really believe it? Even Donald Trump has now said, well, yes, climate is changing, but it's nothing to do with us. We know from all the many, many scientists from all sorts of different disciplines that relate to climate change that it certainly is to do with us, at least mainly to do with us, because of the emissions that we're creating as we burn fossil fuel, as we destroy forests, as we pollute the ocean. And the ocean and the forests are the two great lungs of the world. We talk about the services they produce, but if we talk about the natural environment providing services, which of course it does, but I don't think we should think of it that way, do you? It's there because it's amazing natural world, it's Mother Nature. And just because we benefit from it, because we're part of it and not separate from it, we shouldn't talk about it giving us services. I think it's somehow demeaning. At any rate, that's the way it's talked about. And as we destroy the two great lungs of the world that absorb carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, then we really are damaging the future. And when I meet people who deny climate change, what I do is talk to them. So it's been a long time now since I've been traveling around the world talking about the problems that we all face. And as you all know, I spent many years in Gombe National Park in Tanzania, studying the chimpanzees, finding out how like us they are, and forcing science eventually to admit that we humans are not, as I was taught in 1960s, we are not the only beings on the planet with personality, mind, and above all, emotions. And so as we destroy the natural habitat in one way or another, we're destroying other sentient, sapient beings. We're destroying our own future. So I like to tell people stories. I've been in Greenland, where there's that great wall of ice going up and up and up to the ice cap over the top of the world. And I was there in I think it was about 1990 something. And I was with a group of Inuit elders. It was the end of winter. And as we looked at this great wall of ice, there was water pouring out of it. And there were pieces, huge slabs of ice crashing off with a great roar and more water gushing out. And these huge pieces of ice going out into the ocean. It was with the Inuit elders who told me, even in summer, the ice didn't melt here, even in summer. And they were crying. So as the ice goes out into the ocean, of course it melts eventually, and the sea level begins to rise. And it's also true that as the sea heats up, the water expands. So what with the ice melting, not only from the polar ice, but also from the glaciers on the mountains. And so as this happens, as we create the rising of the sea levels, this is having devastating effect, not only on nature, but on people. So having been in Greenland and standing with those Inuit elders, I went, it wasn't planned, but I actually went to Panama. And I met many indigenous people who'd been living on the little islands offshore. And here in New Zealand, you have lots of little offshore islands. But I was meeting people who'd had to leave their homes because at high tide, the sea level had risen and it was no longer safe, it was no longer habitable for them to stay in their homes. So they had to relocate onto the land. And because I have this crazy travel 300 days a year around the world, you know, everywhere I go, there are people saying to me, well, the weather patterns are crazy, and it should be raining now, and it's a dry season. Or it should be dry now, but it's raining. It should be hot, but it's cold. And this is everywhere that I go. And it's very disturbing to find that we humans, with our activities, creating these changed weather patterns. And I've been to places where they say, well, we've always had hurricanes, but we've never had so many, so frequently, and so many terrible ones. There was maybe one terrible hurricane per half century, but now they're coming more and more frequently, and they're worse and worse, and they're causing horrible devastation. And it's a kind of warning of things to come if we don't do something about it. And in a way I've been privileged to travel around and see these things with my own eyes. But at the same time, if you can imagine being me and learning what we're doing to the planet, it's a bit devastating. I wish I didn't know a lot of this stuff. I really do. The other day I saw a photograph. I was with one Inuit elder in Greenland called Angangak, and he's a kind of sage, something like that. And he sent me another photograph where he was standing in exactly the same place. And as I'm no good with numbers, I can't remember the number of feet, but looking at that picture, side by side with the picture of me and him standing there in the 90s, the ice cap had dropped. It was amazing, and it was shocking, and it was frightening. And so I'm learning all that we're doing to the planet through our actions. I'm learning about the way that we're destroying the forests in various ways, differing in various places. The one that I think impacts you a lot is the destruction of the forests in Malaysia and Indonesia for oil palm plantations. I think many of you know about the devastation of the natural world to grow oil palm, to grow palm trees, and the fight to get this at least labelled so that we can try and buy products where the palm oil comes from sustainable palm oil plantations. The trouble is, I've talked to the people in Malaysia who are trying to fight it from the government, and they say it's really difficult to certify that any palm oil has been obtained from one of these so-called sustainable forests, because there are little links in the food chain all the way along, and you're never quite sure where this sample, this product that you're buying, how did it originate. So it's not easy, but fighting for labelling is important, and labelling sustainable plantation is important because it makes people think, okay, this comes from a sustainable palm oil plantation. What does that mean? What about the unsustainable plantations? And then people are anxious to find out what that means. And what that means is that these palm oil plantations are devastating huge areas. They're encroaching on old growth forests. And those old growth forests in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other Asian countries, and now that the palm oil has spread to forested areas in Africa and Latin America, this is destroying the biodiversity of the area, this amazing, complex tapestry of life. And I learned in the forest at Gombe that each of these little species that makes up this tapestry in a given area plays a role. And it may seem insignificant if a small insect becomes extinct, or locally extinct, or a little plant becomes extinct. But that small species may be the major food source of another creature, which may be a little higher up the food chain. So that might become extinct. And actually, if you look it all up, there are many examples where losing one small species has led to a chain reaction that resulted in ecosystem collapse. That's what's happening. And so, what's causing all of this? Well, we are creating these so-called greenhouse gases. What are the greenhouse gases? I'm sure you all know, but it's like we're creating a blanket of gases that are circling the globe, and they're trapping the heat of the sun. And that's what's leading to global warming, which is causing these changes in weather pattern, and it's something that now we're calling it climate crisis. And so how are we creating these greenhouse gases? Well, first of all, as you all know, we're recklessly burning fossil fuel. And we're burning fossil fuel in our transport, in our industry, in all kinds of ways. And there are so many amazing initiatives to create clean, green energy without burning fossil fuels. But what happens? So often, the oil and gas companies, they want to go on making profit. They don't want this clean, green energy. It's been proved that places in China and India and some in the US are completely off the grid. They're not needing the fossil fuels. They can get it all from the sun or the wind, and in some places the tide. But the fossil fuel industry doesn't want that to happen. They want to go on destroying the environment and removing the fossil fuel. And now we've got this horror of fracking. All over the UK, where I come from, there's fracking. It's causing earthquakes. And people are protesting. They're tying themselves to trees. The government takes no notice because they are fed by these oil and gas industries who are very wealthy. And to hang on to their political careers, they're caving in and allowing fracking to happen. It's not the will of the people. So what does democracy mean? That's why I say I'm not giving you a sort of thought-out, careful presentation. I'm just throwing out these ideas as they came into my head while I was thinking about what I would say to you. So burning of fossil fuel definitely is adding to these greenhouse gases. But then there's another one, and that's why cow has come along. And cow is my symbol for the intensive animal farming. It's a fact that as countries get wealthier around the world, more and more people are eating more and more meat. And in some countries like China, it's a status symbol. When I was growing up in the war years in England, I had meat maybe once a week, and that was a treat. We had one little tiny joint on Sunday, and that had to last. It was made into mince and heated up and goodness knows what. And there were people living in extreme poverty in World War II, and all they had in the way of meat protein was they would go to the butcher and get the bones after all the meat had been sold. And if they were friends with the butcher would leave a little bit of meat on it and they made it into stew. But they survived. And I became a vegetarian quite a long time ago now. It was like, the very late 60s. And I became a vegetarian because I read a book by Peter Singer, who's a philosopher. And he wrote this book called Animal Liberation. When I went to Gombe, age 26, as far as I know, there were no intensive factory farms for animals in the UK. They started in USA. And do you know what they were based on? They were actually based on the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was based on Ford Motors and the way that they created their assembly lines to produce cars. It's a strange story, and we don't need to dwell on it. But anyhow, I became a vegetarian because of the horrible cruelty to the animals in these farms, where they're treated like victims of the Nazis, the Jewish victims of the Nazis in the Holocaust. And so once I learned about it and was horrified by it, the next time I looked at a piece of meat on my plate, I thought, this is symbolizing fear, pain, death. I don't want to eat that. So I just stopped. It was like one day I was, I'd grown up eating little bits of meat, not much. And the next day, I never wanted to touch it again. So it's the reason that this is important. First of all, there's the cruelty to animals. Some people seem to think because farm animals are bred for food, they don't have emotions, they don't have feelings. That's why piglets is here. Pigs are as intelligent as dogs, more intelligent than some. And after this, I want you all to Google, not Picasso the artist, but Pigcasso. You will love what you see, and I'm not going to tell you. It's something you can find out. No, not now. You look at it afterwards. You can't forget, can you? No, Picasso. Pigcasso. At any rate, so these features I'll send to you. And there's a horrible video of a calf being snatched from the mother, and the cow running after this truck which is taking her calf off to slaughter. And she's bellowing in agony. and finally she collapses on the road because she can't run any further. But, okay, so you don't care about animal suffering, fine. What about the environment? You care about the environment. Because there are now millions of animals in these factory farms to produce meat cheaply, they have to be fed. So huge areas of the environment are destroyed to grow the grain. There is more grain grown today to feed animals than to feed starving people. That is a fact. So when you have grown this grain, of course it uses up a lot of fossil fuel. The grain's got to be planted. Then there's this terrible fertilizing. We use this monoculture, and to keep the plants alive, they have to be given artificial fertilizer, which is destroying the soil, and so on and so on and so on. I'm sure you know about that. But in addition, fossil fuel to take the grain to the animals to the slaughterhouse, and the meat to the table. And in addition to that, it wastes a lot of precious water, changing vegetable to animal protein. And water, people say, will be the cause of the next major wars on this planet, because we're running out of fresh drinking water. And we're even polluting and draining the deep aquifers under the ground, because it seems all right to people to steal the water that's going off to nurture some ecosystem somewhere else. Let's steal it here to grow crops, to feed people, even where crops shouldn't be grown because it's dry, desert-like country. Fine, we'll steal the water from somebody else and grow the crops here, because then we can make money. Why shouldn't we? It's ours for the taking. So, okay, waste of water. But then, in addition to that, food goes in here, gas comes out the other end. It's just the normal mammalian digestive system. And sadly, it's even worse with cattle, because they're ruminants. They bring the food up and they do a lot of belching. And the farting and the belching is methane. And that's an even more virulent greenhouse gas than CO2. Luckily, not as plentiful. And it does get made in other ways, of course, but the intensive agricultural farming is said to be a major source. And so that's leading to climate change. And I bet if you all get together and start thinking, you can find other ways that we're creating climate change, that we're creating changed weather patterns, that we're heating up the surface of the globe. So what does this mean? What does it mean that we're heating up, other than the increased frequency of hurricanes and typhoons and the worst examples of terrible flooding and the dreadful droughts? I've just come from Australia, and there are places there where now it hasn't rained for 7 years. They've had to kill their livestock because they can no longer keep them alive. And it's the same in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So that is a major consequence of heating up the globe. But it's also, as it changes the weather patterns, it's upsetting things like the migration of so many animals. I've been going every year for about, 15 years to watch the migration of the sandhill cranes in Nebraska. And normally you can, like clockwork, you can predict about when they're going to arrive. And tourists come and see them. It's the most amazing sight, hundreds of thousands of birds coming in to roost on the Platte River. But now the climate has changed, and there were a lot of tourists this year who went to watch the migration, and the birds arrived, but the climate was wrong, so they went back where they came from. And they didn't return to the Platte River for another 2 or 3 weeks. And that's happening everywhere. And often people don't even notice it. And because foods that are eaten by insects ripen later or earlier, depending on the climate change, that means that birds are dying because the insects they depend on are no longer there when they arrive from their migration. So again, that's something you can all think about if you're interested, and find out examples locally of what does this change mean. And I don't have all the facts for you, not at all. I just know there are changes. Corals, as the oceans warm, corals are dying. And that was made very, very clear to me when I was in Australia, because they've got the Great Barrier Reef, and in so many places it's dying. And of course, the other thing that's happening to the oceans is that we're polluting them, and we're polluting them with the industrial chemical poisons that are used in agriculture, that are used in industry, and that are used in household waste. And these poisons, I mean, don't you think it's peculiar that we think it's okay to put poisonous substances onto the land and onto the crops that we're going to eat ourselves? Isn't that crazy? And people have been fighting this for years, fighting Monsanto because of the Roundup pesticide. No, it's a herbicide. They sell this Roundup herbicide, and that's genetically modified plants. Into each cell is put a toxin that will repel pests, but also that will enable it to stand up against this herbicide designed to kill what they call agricultural weeds. And so these poisons that are used for these purposes are washed down in the rains. They're also killing the soil, of course, but they're washed down in the rains into the rivers and eventually get out into the ocean, adding to the pollution. And you all know about the plastic bags. I'm sure you talked about that this morning. So we're polluting this great lung of the world, the ocean. We're destroying the forests by cutting them down for various reasons. It's kind of sad, isn't it, when you think what we're doing? And none of it is your fault. The reason Roots and Shoots began is because when I was traveling around the world talking about all these things that we're doing to poor old Mother Earth, I was meeting many young people your age, basically your age and university students, who seemed to have lost hope. And some of them were really depressed. Some of them were angry, became violent. Most of them were sort of apathetic. It didn't seem to matter what they did. They didn't care. There were no people doing climate marches, as has just happened in different countries around the world. There was this huge sense of apathy. And when I talked to them, they all said more or less the same thing. And I'm talking about North America, South America, different Asian countries, Europe, different African countries. It was the same everywhere. They said, well, you've harmed our future, and there's nothing we can do about it. So I'm sure at least some of you have heard this saying, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents, we've borrowed it from our children. But we haven't borrowed your future. We've been stealing it, and we're still stealing it today. So, is it too late? Were the young people right when they said there was nothing they could do about it? I think you all know that's not true. I think you all know that there is indeed something you can do about it. And it's my greatest hope for the future, is young people gradually becoming empowered as they understand the problems. And people are listening to your voices, and that's empowering you to take action. And I think you're helped by social media, because if you care about an issue passionately, whether it's meat eating or whether it's burning fossil fuel or palm oil or whatever it is, you can send out messages, just pop with a little button or two, to young people around the world, and get all those who care about this issue to stand up and make their voices heard. And that eventually is going to make a difference. There's something else that I find is very important. It's very easy for us to point fingers at, let's say, pointing fingers at industry, at corporations, businesses. And we're mad at them because they're producing things in an unethical way. But, you know, as consumers, we have a responsibility. If we don't like the way that a product is made, we shouldn't buy it. And yet people are deciding not to buy organic food because maybe it costs a little bit more. But unless you're very poor, then if something costs a little bit more, one, it's taking account of the real cost of producing it. Two, you will value it more if you've paid more for it. Three, you will waste less. And the amount of food wasted around the world is truly shocking. It really is shocking. And, you know, young people buy clothes and they don't want to wear them after 6 months or a year, so they throw them out. We don't have to do that. We can go on wearing our clothes as long as they're not too full of holes or something. So we, the consumer, have a lot to do with the way that corporations behave, and indeed it's beginning to make a difference. There are corporations that are doing things in a different way. There are businesses springing up that are ethical. And as more and more people buy those products, then the whole of business will ultimately change. And I am afraid that's going to be your responsibility, because you're the next lot of consumers. I'll be dead and gone. I plan to have a very biologically sustainable, ethical funeral. But anyway, never mind that. You know, there are people that can be put in a Hessian sack and buried under the ground. It's actually legal. I think it's a great idea, but you know, let's not go too much into that. You know, I'll be gone and you'll be left. And the mess that we've made, you're going to have to sort out. And that's why I want to use the rest of my years on this planet, however many there are, going around and helping you to understand that every single day you live, you make some impact on the planet. And it may seem small, that's what people are more aware about the environmental problems today, and they think around the globe and they get so depressed, they become apathetic and they do nothing, because they don't know what to do. They feel helpless and hopeless. But the point is, if everybody makes small changes, makes ethical choices in what they buy, what they wear, what they eat, it may seem not important what I do, and if it was just me, it wouldn't matter two hoots. But it's not. It's this growing number of increasingly aware people. And once they know, yes, there is something I can do, every little thing I do each day, there will be a cumulative effect which is moving us towards a better world for your future and the future of your children. And it's really true. And I like to imagine the world as a giant jigsaw puzzle with hundreds of thousands of little pieces. And everywhere where we've destroyed the planet or where we've got some social injustice, the pieces of the jigsaw are black. But you can see what's going on in the world around you. You can say, see for yourself, this river is polluted. This river is letting pollutants out into the ocean. This place has been denuded of trees. I can start a program to plant trees. Here there's an animal that needs help. I can spread information about it, that sort of thing. Take your little piece of the jigsaw, work on it with your friends, and gradually it will turn from black to green. And know that all around the world, the roots and shoots are there. So as far as we know, as far as we can tell, the only planet we have that we can call home, at least in the foreseeable future, is planet Earth. And how is it possible that the most intellectual species to ever walk the planet can be destroying its only home? We can send rockets to Mars. We can walk on the moon. We can dive deep, deep down into the deepest depths of the ocean. And yet, with this great intellect, we destroy the planet. Isn't it crazy? Do you think there's been a disconnection between this clever brain, which distinguishes us from the other animals, and the human heart, love and compassion? Because I think that only when head and heart work in harmony can we attain our true human potential. And our true potential in each one of us is huge. Every one of us. We all have a brain. We all have a heart. And let's put them together. Let's not forget their compassion and the love that we need to make this a better world. And so, there we are. That's what Roots and Shoots is all about. You had your workshop this morning, and there's an awful lot more I could say, but actually I want to hear your questions. And so I think I'm going to stop at that point and see who would like to. I may not be able to answer your questions, but we can try. Whatever you say. You choose.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
so we've already taken a couple of questions from the audience. So Shian wants to know, what are your suggestions or ideas regarding what the most important action we could do as youth to make sure our voices are heard by large, dominant organisations and all people in power?
Well, I think I've kind of answered that, haven't I? Don't you think we can make choices, we can make ethical choices, we can stand up to the governments, we can lobby, we can make our voices heard, we can insist that this isn't the way to go. Trouble is, first of all, you have to have a democracy that works. And I regret to say, in my own country, the UK democracy is not working. And hundreds of people didn't want the Iraq war, and they went out onto the streets. It was the same in France, it was the same in Germany, but the governments took no notice and went to war anyway. So we need to work on our democracy. Any of you who want to go into government, there's a really good goal for you. Let's create a really good democracy. And I think here in New Zealand you're lucky. Your Prime Minister really does care about the environment. She really does care about your future. But some of you perhaps have other countries and something to think about. And then we've talked about how we change big business through our choices as consumers.
What role do you believe environmentally friendly businesses play in providing sustainable products to people and families from global?
Sorry, what role do I?
What role do you believe environmentally friendly businesses play in providing sustainable products to people and families from low income backgrounds?
Well, okay, we've sort of touched on that, but there are three things we have to address before we can actually move into this better world that we all want. And I talked about making choices. I suspect every single one of you can go into a shop and make a choice between this or that. You can probably all choose a more environmentally friendly product or a more humane product, I suspect. But there are hundreds and thousands, millions of people around the world who cannot afford to make that choice. If you're living out in, say, for example, rural Africa, you're going to cut down the last trees, not because you don't know that that is going to harm the environment, but because you've got to feed your family and you've overused the fertile land. So you desperately cut down the last trees, either to make charcoal, to make some money, or to grow a bit more food to feed your family. And if you're in an urban area, you're going to buy the cheapest food. You can't afford to say, how was it made? Did it harm the environment? Did it result in cruelty to animals? Is it cheap because of child slave labour or sweatshops somewhere else? You can't afford, you have to buy the cheapest. So we've got to alleviate poverty. Then we've got to think about what we've already talked about, each one of us leaving a lighter ecological footprint, thinking about what we do in our own lives to make this a better world and to try to move towards a better future. And that's not easy. But that's why I love Roots and Shoots and other youth organisations, because you young people can become very passionate. And I know so many parents who say, well, of course I recycle, my kids made me. Or of course I buy organic food because my kids won't eat anything else. And some of these parents may be CEOs, and some of these parents may be in government. And so there's a huge chance that you have of influencing older people to make this a better world. And then finally, there's something people never talk about, because it's the most difficult one of all, but we have to consider it, and that is human population growth. Just imagine, we're on this planet with finite natural resources. They will not last forever. And how is it possible that economists believe that we can have unlimited economic development on this planet with finite resources, while more and more people are wanting more and more as they get wealthier, and the population is still growing. Does that make sense to anybody? That's why for a long time I joined, I think it's called Population Matters. It's one of the big international things. When I first began talking about population, it was in the 70s. There's a book that was written then by a friend of mine, Paul Ehrlich. If you're interested in this, you might be interested to read it, because this is way back in the mid-70s he wrote it. And it's called The Population Bomb. He was absolutely right. But none of the big environmental organizations would talk about it. No, it's politically sensitive. It was partly because back then people talked about population control. So you think of China limiting the number of children. And you think of India doing forced sterilizations and things like that. So I thought, well, I'm going to talk about it anyway, even if it's considered politically incorrect. So I made a term for it, which was voluntary population optimization. How can you criticize that? Voluntary population optimization. So actually, Jane Goodall Institute in the countries in Africa where we work, we are providing microcredit opportunities for women and keeping girls in scholarships in school during and after puberty, because it's been shown all around the world that as women become better educated and more empowered, family size tends to drop. But it's not happening quick enough. We also provide them with family planning information. And things seem to be going in the right direction, but now China and Tanzania, maybe some other countries, are encouraging their people to have more children. What's wrong with us? I'm afraid that so many politicians are there for their own careers. They want to do things that are popular with the big corporations who support them and give them money for their campaigns. So question for all of you, how do we get a country where the government is made up of people who actually think about future generations when they make their decisions, and stop kowtowing to the rich oil and gas companies and the agribusiness, which is one of the worst? How do we get that? I won't be around to help you, but some of you, I bet, will think in those terms, and maybe some of you will come up with some solution.
If you were our age and could do one thing to help the planet, what would it be?
Well, I think actually it's not just one thing, because if we want to be successful, we choose things that we care passionately about. And so for each of you, I'm sure you care passionately about different things. Some of you care about the environment, some of you care about plastic, some of you care about the palm oil situation, some of you care about stray dogs and cats and the way they're treated, some of you care about human population growth. Make choices in your daily life that help you to go to sleep knowing I really tried today to do something to make the world a little bit better. And I can't tell people what to do, that's in their own hearts.
Does anybody have any questions?
You choose them. There's too many.
Yeah. I think you were the first to go.
When did you start seeing evidence of the climate crisis, like in your career? Like, when did you first notice, like, wow, this is
Sorry, I'm going to... Can you take the mic?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
When you get to 85, your ears aren't as good.
I was just wondering, when you first started seeing evidence of the climate crisis, like, in your career, like, when you thought, like, oh my god, this is really something that needs to be, like, important and dealt with? Like, when did you first see that?
When did it first come to...
Yeah, like, when did you first, like, see evidence of it?
Well, it was when I was travelling around the world. I think it first hit me, really hit me, when I was in Greenland and saw that melting ice. It was a real shock, because when the ice broke off, it makes this huge noise which reverberates. And I was with Inuits who were crying. And it was just, it really think you really don't start feeling until something gets to your heart. And that's why telling stories is the most important way of changing people's minds. Telling stories.
I will take two more.
You've talked a lot about the vegetarian diet. I'm just wondering what your views are on the dairy industry. Like in New Zealand, 60% of our lakes and rivers are now polluted because our dairy industry is so big.
Well, that actually is a problem for New Zealand, but we've been talking about it a lot. And the answer to that is we have to find alternative ways for the farmers to make a living, alternative ways of using the land, and somehow it's a very, very difficult situation. And as I told you at the beginning, I am not somebody who can wave a wand and solve all the problems of the world. I know what the problems are, and talking about them is helpful. And then just relying on the fact that there are incredible brains that we have, and getting the right people together, not these big conferences where everybody talks and papers are written, and they don't amount to much except maybe coming to some conclusion and people sign on to it. So I think it's something in New Zealand, you have to get some really good brains together, bring in the farming community, bring in the economists, and try and see what can New Zealand do that will give it the same amount of income and prosperity, but without torturing animals.
Okay, one last question.
So I just wanted to ask something like a little more hopeful because it's.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I just wanted to ask, what keeps you going? Like, where do you find the hope to get out of your
Good, I was going to say this anyway. I'm glad you asked it as a question. So, because people are always asking me, how can you be hopeful when you look around? And remember what I talked about, the black pieces of the jigsaw gradually going green? Well, I think what gives me hope is that everywhere I go, I meet incredible people doing extraordinary projects. So way back in 1986, when I realized that in Tanzania chimp numbers were dropping, and that this was true all over Africa, where chimps lived, where forests were disappearing, the beginning of the bushmeat trade, mothers shot to sell their babies, people moving deeper into the forest as populations grew, and exposing chimps to diseases which they can catch because they're so like us, but they haven't built up immunity to them. And so I thought, well, I must go to Africa. I must try and find out more about this with my own eyes so that I can talk about it. And as I was finding out more about the problems facing the chimps, I was also learning about the plight of so many African people living in great poverty in and around chimpanzee forest habitat. And it came to a head when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park, where I began in 1960, at which time it was part of the equatorial forest belt that stretched from east to west Africa. And by 1990, it was a tiny island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills, with more people living there than the land could support. And that's when it hit me, if we don't help the people, we can't even try to save the chimps. And so JGI began a program called Take Care, Utakari, and a select group of 7 local Tanzanians went into the 12 villages around Gombe National Park. And not a bunch of arrogant white people saying, well, we're going to do this and everything will be good. No. Asked them, what did they think we could do to make their lives better? And that's where we started. We gradually introduced more interventions, including microcredit based on Mohammed Yunus's Grameen Bank, and these programs about fertility for the women and children, all delivered by local people. And it was so successful, it's now in 104 villages through the whole range of chimps in Tanzania. And they've all provided volunteers they can learn to use smartphones even if they can't read and write. And as most chimps don't live in protected areas, but in village forest reserves where they're not protected at all, because the people now understand that protecting the environment is not just for wildlife, but it's for their own future, that they need these services that the natural environment can provide. And so these volunteer monitors are very proud, and they go in and they record on their smartphones an illegally cut tree or an animal trap, or perhaps it's sighting a chimp or a pangolin or something like that. And that all goes up to a platform in the clouds called Global Forest Watch. And so all these people have now become partners in conservation because we're helping them to improve their lives, which is kind of coming back to the question about the dairy farming in New Zealand. But so successful, that program is now in 7 other African countries around chimp habitats. So if you fly over Gombe today, you won't see an island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills, because there aren't any bare hills anymore. The trees have come back. This resilience of the seeds under the ground, and sometimes the roots, give it time. So the resilience of nature is a huge reason for hope. And here in New Zealand, you've got so many places. I was in Wikilandia, or Wicklandia, whatever it is. Yes. Zealandia. Yeah, Zealandia. And went around, which was destroyed by gold mining, and is now a beautiful forest filled with native birds and some mammals and plants as well, reptiles as well. And you've got many other examples. There's a young man, Joachim, also in Wellington, and he's working to restore a forest where the land was cleared. He's been doing it for 10 years, and I went to that forest, and it's becoming beautiful. They pointed out a tree he planted 10 years ago, and it's taller than the ceiling now. And of course it's all done carefully with indigenous species. And so animals on the brink of extinction can be given another chance. And my favourite story, actually, from the whole world, is one from New Zealand. And you can look it up, there isn't time to go into it now, but it's called a black robin. And the black robin was reduced because of introduced cats and rats and things like that. It was reduced to 7 birds. And the 7 birds were taken to an offshore island. And the biologist, it was done by Don Merton, he went back with his team the next spring. And to their horror, there was one fertile female. She had an infertile male, and they're supposed to mate for life. And there were 2 other younger males. That's all that was left. And he did something which was very risky of him, but he'd seen it done in a captive situation. So, first of all, the female, it was called Blue, because she had a blue leg band. She dumped her infertile male, and she took one of the new younger males, who was called Blue, because he had a blue band around his foot. And they produced a nest, and she laid eggs. And Don destroyed the nest and put the eggs in a tomtit's nest. And she made another nest, as he had prayed and hoped, and laid 2 more eggs. And then Don thought, well, now these eggs hatching in the tomtit nest, they've got to learn to behave like black robins and not tomtits. So he took the 2 little fledglings and added them to Blue's nest. And then he took her 2 eggs away and put them in another tomtit nest. And she laid a 3rd one, he left her with those. But then he thought, well, I have to take the other babies back. So now there she is, she's hatching 2 eggs. She's got 2 families, her previous ones, that have been raised by tomtits. And when he took the last 2, he said, she looked up at me as if to say, what next? He said, it's all right, darling, we're going to help you. And so they ran around collecting all the things to help feed the growing fledglings. And now there's over 500 of them. And so that's, something like that gives me hope. But, the greatest hope is all of you. Actually, the greatest hope is all of you. And finally, the indomitable human spirit, which is why I carry Mr. H. So Mr. H was given to me by a man called Gary Horn, which is why he's Mr. H. And Gary Horn went blind when he was 21. And for some bizarre reason, he decided to become a magician. Everybody said, but Gary, how can you be a magician when you're blind? He arranges his props beforehand, he does shows for kids. They don't notice he's blind. I've watched him several times. And at the end he'll tell them, and he'll say something might go wrong in your life, but don't give up, there's always a way forward. And he does cross-country skiing and scuba diving and skydiving, and he's just taught himself to paint. He gave me Mr. H 29 years ago for my birthday, thinking he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee. I made him hold the tail. He said, never mind, take him where you go, and you know my spirit's with you. So Mr. H has been with me to 65 countries. He's my symbol for this indomitable human spirit. And there are so many people that you can meet if you bother to listen to their life story, and you see, wow, they have this indomitable spirit. There's a Canadian, Chris Koch, you can look him up, K-O-C-H. And he was born with no legs and arms to here, not thick, but little kind of spindly outcroppings. And one thing that looks like a flipper coming from his thigh. And on one of these little funny stumpy things, there's a tiny outgrowth that maybe was once a thumb. He has been round the world on a skateboard, through Europe on a skateboard. He drives one of these multi-$1,000 tractors. Watching him take a cell phone out of his pocket with these, I mean, they're no longer than that. And when you meet him and you sit talking to him, he'll hop up on the sofa. I mean, I was getting ready to sit on the floor, but he hopped up on the sofa. And you're looking into a face that is so filled with intelligence and energy and enthusiasm. And I said to him, Chris, have you ever thought of having prosthetic legs or arms? And he said, well, people have offered it to me. But he said, I think maybe I was put together like this for some reason. So I think I'll stay as I am. And then he thought for a bit and he said, but I just might take them up when I decide to climb Mount Everest. No arms, no legs, but a vision and dreams, the indomitable human spirit. And you know, each single one of you has that same spirit. Let it out, let it grow, let it inspire others, and let it keep you hopeful as you travel through and try to sort out the horrible mess that we left you in, for which I apologize. So, there you are. Workshop. Did you do what we do in Tanzania at the end of every Roots and Shoots meeting? You didn't, okay. Well, Tanzania, where we began with 12 high school students, we now have 2,000 groups. And we deliberately try and mix up Christians and Muslims, which should be done all over the world, and because those are the two main religions there. So I was there celebrating the anniversary of the founding of Roots and Shoots this February. And there were about 400 high school and university students, and they'd been talking about all the amazing projects they're doing. And at the end in Tanzania, the members were saying, together we can. And I said, yes, we can, but will we? And so now the call is, together we can, together we will. So if anybody here wants to help make the world a better place, can we do it together? Together we can, together we will. Once more.